And this now brings us to the panel discussion on economic development and modernization with lessons from Japan. I'd like to call Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja of the Geopolitical Cartographer to moderate the discussion. And to join the ambassador on the panel, I call Ms. Azusa Kubota, UNDP resident representative in Sri Lanka, and Senior Professor H.D. Karunaratne, Vice Chancellor of the University of Colombo.
I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone here. Honorable President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I think the Japanese economic miracle from around 1945 to about 1991 was pretty extraordinary. It led to really this dramatic transformation of Japan, as Ambassador said, from a devastated war-torn economy to the second largest economy in the world after the United States, and certainly Asia's only industrial economy at that time. And that boom lasted about 40 years and came to sort of an end in some way in the 1990s, where Japan went into a kind of a period of stagnation and what is sort of popularly known as the lost decade. But this 40-year period was kind of a golden era, and I think that's what we are going to look at now, which is what were some of the critical ingredients in this boom that Japan engineered, and this very interesting question of what others may learn from Japan that could be appropriate for contexts such as Sri Lanka, which have suffered this debt and economic crisis. Are there sort of salient features from that we may draw? And the question there is, can we take piecemeal Japan's approach, or do we take some elements from this? Now, we have a terrific panel here. We have Ambassador Mizukoshi himself on it. We have the Vice Chancellor of Colombo University, H.D. Karunaratne, Senior Professor, and we have Azusa Kubota to give us some thoughts. And I thought we would start with a few remarks from the other two panelists in response to what the ambassador said, and then we would have a question and answer session.
Honorable President and speakers, all participants, thank you very much for providing this opportunity. Excuse me for my voice today. I was delighted to be 12 years in Japan and 8 universities learning and teaching development economics. So we see a very important lesson we can get from Japan, particularly in terms of institutional setup, policies, and the management system and outcome of the Japanese policies. Number one is institutional setup. Japan has a unique setup of institute where the economic planning agency plan the economy in every 10 years, 20 years, and they make it plans with the evidence, where they take the decisions based on the evidence. The Japan is one of the countries in the world, they have data. So this, for example, country like Sri Lanka, we are not taking decisions based on input-output table. In Japan, they use much on where the resources coming, where are the resources going. So as a result, this decision making is with the data. Number two is the policies. There are some other institutions like MITI and of course the central bank, and maintaining the macroeconomic policies. The macroeconomic policies very important during the last 70 years in Japan, because they never had a trade deficit or they never had the budget gap like Sri Lanka. The gap between these two gaps, we are running with the twin deficit, where the Japan had the surplus, because the Japanese government expenditure, they mainly limited to infrastructure development, mainly economic infrastructure development, not the social infrastructure development. If we take the Sri Lanka, what is the government expenditure? We are mainly going with the loss-making firms and public sector employment, wages, and the interest rate for the past loans. So the all unproductive expenditure we have, but in Japan, mainly the government expenditure centered into providing the economic infrastructure and facilitating the forthcoming industries. There is a industrialization pattern in Japan. In economic theory says that is called flying geese pattern of industrialization. Japanese government always helped the new coming industries, not the outdated outgoing industries. So investment in forthcoming industries very important. And the policies made the link between the large firms, small firms, and the competitive law. The competition law was very practical in Japan. So in that sense, the right policies they took in right time. As a result, Japan is the country that showed to the world that based on the domestic savings rate, they can go for the development. They did not rely on investment from other countries. Like for example, we are always expecting the foreign investment. But the Japanese development, you can see, based on the local savings, how the local savings they generate, their income was far higher than their consumption. Each and every family had a very nice financial literacy. How the financial literacy created? Investing in education. Investing in education is one of the important aspects of Japanese development. We also invested, but not much to that level to the investment. Particularly, we know in Sri Lankan context, we have about 11,000 schools, but only 4,000 schools have this STEM-based teachers, mathematics teachers, English language teachers, and of course the science teachers. So as a result, what has happened in Sri Lanka, we know the number of people who are sitting for advanced level is a big problem. You know, for example, if you take statistics in last year, 2022 advanced level, the 263,000 students at the advanced level, out of which only 1,600 students selected English as a subject. But Sinhala as a subject, 55,000 selected. Why they select the Sinhala as a subject? Because that is the only subject they can pass in their school. Because large number of schools in Sri Lanka, we do not have these facilities for particularly STEM education. But Japan, it is totally different. Regionally, they cannot go into other region schools. If there is what we call one area, that students should go to the same school. So as a result, that school has kind of a more investment from the government, all STEM-based education. And our education, we know in advanced level, we have 3, 4, 5 divisions, like commerce, management, like that. But Japan, the advanced level means a deeper study on all level. The same, everybody do mathematics in advanced level. No one can escape from the mathematics in advanced level. So this is unique education system. So investing in education system, particularly in Sri Lanka, we have misunderstood the higher education. Higher education has 3 components. That is university education, technical education, and of course, we have professional education. So professional education in the context of Sri Lanka, highly monopolized. Few people graduate as, I think in South Asia, we are one of the lowest professionals producing country. But Japan, it is totally different. All professional institutes produce more technicians, more professionals. So technical education and professional education put the lack in Sri Lanka if you compare with the Japan. So in that case, the Japanese high quality investment on education and database decision making better growth than the Sri Lankan context. So we also have to think about if we are investing in social capital, social infrastructure, that should be number one, investing in particularly education sector, where number of researchers in private organization has grown extensively during this period. So as a result, the private industries benefited with the new research and industrial structure change based on that research. So this is some, I think I took a little bit time. I have many things to elaborate, I will do later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, for those points. May I turn now to the UNDP representative, Azusa Kubota, for her 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency the President and all the distinguished guests. I was just wondering what what helped me earn a seat in this very prestigious panel. I think there are two things that I can think of. One is that we just signed an MOU with the Embassy of Japan for our anti-corruption support program for SIABOC, which has been already mentioned by His Excellency, the ambassador. And also that I, as a Japanese, although I'm a UN official, I was raised by parents who were born in the middle of the war and have actually withstood very difficult lifestyle, made personal sacrifices to contribute to the recovery process. So I have some personal anecdotes that have always made me wonder what made the Japanese experience so unique and different. The ambassador has talked a lot about the sense of unity and solidarity. I called it more developmental psychology or behavioral economics, or perhaps national psyche that has made it possible for people to support very difficult reform programs. And since I'm surrounded by renowned economists, I would like to talk a little bit about more soft side of the environment ecosystem that has allowed for transformation. I give you one story of my father, late father. He was born in Dalian under Japanese occupation and came back to Japan. And when I was growing up, the local newspaper always published the top 100 people paying the most taxes. And my father always made sure that he was one of the top 3. He made sure to pay more taxes. I never understood. But I think now I think about it, it really reflected people's trust in institutions and leadership, that the taxes people pay will be invested in areas where the most vulnerable communities will be supported, and the money will be invested in sectors that would generate revenue and jobs. So that was really the psyche or the mindset of the population, maybe coming from the Oshin era, but people are prepared to make that personal sacrifice. And I think what made that possible was that we had, well, Japan had very strong public sector. Bureaucracy was competent, efficient, and meritocracy system was introduced. And when we talk about reform systems and policies, the bureaucracy must have the anticipatory capability to be able to understand the intergenerational impact of the reforms. And I think proactive communication and reform agenda instilled a certain level of confidence amongst educated and non-educated population. So once again, the importance of strong bureaucracy that supported the I would say, politics of reform. And this is also reflected in a UN framework. If you look at the global SDG Insight Report, which was done by artificial intelligence, the goal on accountable and transparent institution, SDG 16, has been always picked by the machine learning as one of the decisive indicators to achieve all the other SDGs. So basically, if you don't have accountable and transparent institutions, whatever investments you bring about, you will not be able to attain SDGs, other SDGs. And this was also the case for Sri Lanka. An interesting anecdote is that when I try to understand this people's willingness to pay taxes, there's definitely an inherent link between people's trust in institutions, corruption, and tax morale. And the Japanese constitution outlines 2 duties in terms of its people's responsibilities. One is to pay taxes, so it's actually people's duty to pay tax. And second one is to duty to be educated. I think these are 2 factors that are very much needed to propel economic growth and recovery process. And of course, I think people's tax morale has been eroding over the years. But if you look at how Japanese society responds to disasters and natural disasters and crisis, you can still see people's discipline and respect for social order. And a good friend of mine who is a professor of economics in University of Tokyo once told me, Japanese people are fundamentally socialist when it comes to our mindset. There is sort of a sense of unease when we see growing inequality. And maybe it's changing a little bit, but fundamentally, if you look at the pay gap between CEOs and the rest of the workforce, Japan has, amongst OECDs, one of the narrowest gaps. Inequality is very important. Yes. So just coming to anti-corruption issue, I'd like to really commend Sri Lanka for adopting the composite anti-corruption law, which is very progressive, encourages private sector participation in civil society, and we're very much committed to supporting SIABOC with the resources and the capabilities to fully operationalize that. And one of the things that we could use this IMF governance diagnostic report and the reform agenda to really invest in is the prevention of culture of prevention, integrity, which has been recommended under the ANCAC review 2 times in a row. But perhaps in terms of investment, focus has been more on prosecution as opposed to prevention. And the prevention has to start from education system. The Vice Chancellor talked a lot about the educational system. In Japan, there is a weekly class on ethics and morale. It's a secular country, but some of the values that underpin the collectiveness, solidarity, have been taught in school from an early age. So this is perhaps something that Sri Lanka could look into. Once again, I have to wrap it up. So I'd like to conclude by saying that I think this reform is once in historical opportunity to bring about holistic reform agenda, and very much looking forward to hearing more from the panelists.
Thank you very much for those useful thoughts. I thought we will open it up to a few questions that I may pose to the panel, and then we'll open it out to the floor. I wonder if I can start with Ambassador. You talked about some of the key reforms for modernization that Japan adopted to create this economic miracle. I wonder if you could talk about the key reforms and also this very important question of how the LDP created this long-term consensus for business-friendly reforms amongst all the different policies.
Well, as I touched upon in my speech, there have been numerous reforms after World War II. Some are tax reforms. So I think before World War II, the main source of the revenue of the government was tax on land. But after World War II, it became income tax. And one good thing about having an income tax is everyone becomes responsible for the expenditure of the government. So people care about waste of government resources. So that's one reform. And what are the reforms? Farmland reforms. Before World War II, some landlords had a vast land, and peasants worked in those lands. But they were divided to small holders, smallholder farmers. So in that regard as well, each farmer had more responsibility. And there was also a lot of technical advancements in agriculture. So it has made Japan more, it has made agriculture of Japan develop. That's second thing. What are the other things? And the economic plans, as Senior Professor Karunaratne has mentioned, had very important roles. So there has been a long-term planning of economy based on the objective analysis of the economic situation. And those plans have assured some consistency of the economic policies. So those are there are many more reforms, but those are the things that I can think of now. And you have asked about this consensus in the LDP of this economic policy. I think it's because the economic policy, I think, which was planned by the experts in each ministries, like Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Industry, and approved by the politicians of Liberal Democratic Party. And I think there was a trust by the people on those economic policies. And because it was producing results of economic growth, people didn't feel any necessity for changing those economic policies.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I can ask you a related question in Sri Lanka, which I hear a lot about. Now, Japan has this economic miracle, and one of the ways in which miracles may translate across the world, particularly technology transfer and things of that type, is through foreign investment, right? Now, as I observe the data, Sri Lanka has had very little Japanese foreign investment compared to Southeast Asian countries, Thailand and Malaysia. What obstacles do Japanese investors complain about when it comes to Sri Lanka? When people come and see you, new or existing investors, I wonder if you'd share with us. It's a very serious issue for us, obviously.
I think one of the reasons that Japanese businesses are going more into Southeast Asia than, say, Sri Lanka is perhaps size of the consumer market. So ASEAN countries are now making a kind of FTA, so they have a good, more integrated market, and there are connectivity between those countries. So, for example, Japanese automobile companies have invested a lot in Thailand, and they have assembly plants in Thailand, and they are bringing some parts of those automobiles from other countries like Cambodia or Malaysia. So this economic integration of ASEAN has some advantage over Sri Lanka, perhaps. That's one thing. And so I think answer for that is Sri Lanka is next to a huge market, India. So if there's more integration of markets between Sri Lanka and India, I think it's a possibility that Japanese businesses come to Sri Lanka to export to India. That's also same thing with Mexico and the United States. There are many Japanese companies who are investing in Mexico for export to USA as well. And another thing is that, as I pointed out, the problem of corruption or untransparency of the procedures of the government, like customs or any permissions for operations. So they are, I think, discouraging Japanese businesses to come more to Sri Lanka.
No, thank you very much. Now, since we were talking about that subject of rent seeking, I think it's an interesting question. I want to turn to Ms. Kubota. Now, the IMF diagnostic assessment has various recommendations to reduce these rent-seeking corruption vulnerabilities, right? Now, Sri Lanka obviously has variable quality institutions to implement some of these things. From your experience in UNDP, how can the incentives for corrupt practices be used in this weak institutional setting we have in Sri Lanka? What insights UNDP experience? Sure.
I think, as I mentioned, I think looking at the prevention equally important as the prosecution. I think for Sri Lanka's side, the preventive part has been, I would not want to say neglected, but given less importance until recently. And I think the composite law gives an optimal opportunity to balance the two. Digitalization of the process is one, and also the composite law now introduces some of the mechanisms such as the asset declaration system, which has to be funded, and also the SIABOC officials have to be capacitated. And also SIABOC alone, I think we need to remember, alone cannot tackle the issue of corruption. There are various institutions that have to share information across. And also, I know SIABOC is working a number of MOUs to bring about that sharing of information. And I think the composite law provides that opportunity. In terms of incentives, I think at the end of the day, people have to demand it. For example, Vietnam. His Excellency always talks about the example of Vietnam being very successful in withstanding the COVID crisis. It's one of the two countries, China and Vietnam, right, which have actually had continuous growth despite the COVID. How did they do that? If you look at the corruption perception barometers, right, the people of Vietnam actually feel they can fight corruption. They have a role to play in fighting corruption by saying no to bribery, by demanding digitalization of the processes, by demanding greater transparency and consistency of rules and regulations. So at the end of the day, it has to be a societal, whole of the societal thing. That's why I talked about the importance of culture of integrity, right? People have to demand transparency, and they have to be, also they have to realize they have to be part of the solution. Not only talking about SIABOC to the everything, but the culture, societal psyche has to be there to support the reform process.
Thank you. Now, while I have you on the stand, I want to ask you a related question, which also comes from the role of UNDP. There is evidence in Sri Lanka that during this terrible and crippling debt and economic crisis we have faced, there has been a large rise in poverty, as well as, according to survey evidence, child malnutrition, right? Now, from UNDP's institutional experience, how does a country like Sri Lanka, which has gone backwards in poverty, the way I read this data, right, and it's 2019 data, they're updating the databases and so on, what are the best policies to reduce this large poverty and also ensure that we don't come into a malnutrition trap which will then affect future generations of Sri Lankans? What is the best and quickest way to do this from your experience of UNDP?
I give you the sad answer. There's no best or quick answer to this. But what I can say is that, of course, there are different figures floating around in terms of poverty rate. Some say it's doubled, some say it's tripled. But what concerns us the most is that a large number of people are on the blink of falling into poverty. They may not be poor now, but they are very vulnerable. So we should be looking at the vulnerability over and above poverty. And second thing is that when the shocks are so sudden and acute, we have to think of a poverty trap. People get trapped in this perpetual cycle of poverty or vulnerability. It's very difficult to come out. So it has several implications, particularly for social protection system. Our social protection system traditionally is very much about, if I may say so, excuse me if I offend anybody, but it's all about keeping dying patients alive, right? Helping them bring the food to the table for the day. But now we have to be looking at the intergenerational impact of this trap, which is malnutrition. You know, if the children are malnourished, it would have cognitive impact, which will last for years to come, and their productivity, labor force participation, so the impact is intergenerational. So we have to act now, and how do we reform the social protection system, which is government is actively doing, and I like to commend that. One is to look at not only the income level poverty, but look at the multi-dimensional nature of poverty and vulnerability. UNICEF has supported government on MPI, multi-dimensional poverty index, which many governments around the world has adopted. as a way to eradicate poverty. China is a prime example. They used MPI as a measurement, but also policy screening tool to come up with integrated programs to help uplift people out of poverty. Then other dimension is multi-dimensional vulnerability index, which looks at people who are on the margins, basically coming in and out of poverty. So it's focusing on prevention, and how do you do that? By having social protection systems that have a view of graduation. And this doesn't happen intuitively unless we are policy conscious. And what do I mean by that? It's not just the cash transfer that brings food to the table on day-to-day basis, but invest in skills, access to financing, entrepreneurship skills, financial literacy, the whole package to help them come out of that cycle of deprivations. That requires, coming up with evidence and data-driven targeted interventions, and that's something we've been working very closely with the government of Sri Lanka at this moment.
Vice Chancellor, I wonder if I may turn to you. So there is an argument that Ambassador was saying that Sri Lanka might use external pressure, particularly that of the IMF and also its financing, to help sort out our macroeconomic problems. What do you think about that proposition? And do you think the current IMF program goes far enough in giving us the reforms, or would you suggest other things we should be doing as part of our reform program beyond the IMF?
In economics, we say, if there is a crisis, if there is a problem, go back to fundamentals. Now what IMF is doing, reminding us fundamentals, where we have done mistakes. So that is what I hope the ambassador emphasize, the external pressure. Because we have some belief which are not rational in terms of economics. In economics literature it says, go back to fundamentals. What is fundamentals? That the getting prices correct. The behave according to prices, not supporting for market distortions, where they artificially setting high prices or artificially setting low prices is not a way to handle a market economy. Now one of the best things in Japan we can learn, let the market to work. In Japan, each and every area, the rural area, market work very well. Not the government is interfering for everyone's life. And going back to fundamentals, we need to take, again coming back to that, decisions based on the data. Now why the government revenue is low in Sri Lanka? We don't have a good database. We are not taking the tax from the who should really pay the tax. Japan has my number. So everyone's income is recorded. Everyone knows how much money earned and he has to pay. Of course, if it is not coming from the culture where that if we believe that values and attitudes, then it should be done by scientific way based on the data. So to run the market efficiently, we have to take the decisions based on data. So therefore, the external pressure, or the IMF what is telling that you have gone in irrational way. What is the irrational way? As I pointed out, we spend every year large amount of government money for what? Keep the loss-making institute. So what IMF say, that you have to privatize and you have to go for the rational price-based decisions in free market system. And of course it is the economic principle, economic science. Economics is not an art, economics is a science, where you have to take scientific decision based on the data. If there are no data, the economic decisions are taken by emotions, politicians, or someone else. So that is not rational. The IMF always talking about make the market effective. So for that what we need to understand the philosophy. External pressure, for example, Japan, they got an external pressure, dissolve the Zaibatsu. Why? Because during the wartime, these large conglomerates, they had the war type production. So The other group wanted to destroy this water production continuing in future. But they got the advantage. Later, even US removed that, the dissolution of Saibatsu, because they shifted into more productive industries. So the industrialization in Japan was very much market-based system, where policies came, but they produced for the market. So therefore, I hope that what IMF has come 17 times to Sri Lanka. Why we invited IMF each and every time, think that we have taken large number of irrational decisions in economics where we cannot sustain in that manner. We need to take the sustainable economic policies rather than unsustainable economic policies where our expenditure is far higher than the income. Then always there has been widening budget gap, there has been widening external gap. So all these because unproductive things we have done. Thank you.
Thank you. While I have you, I want to ask you another question, which I know is one of the areas of your interest, is since the debt crisis, Sri Lanka has seen a vast outflow of young and skilled professionals, right? I believe in the university you have lost maybe 20 to 30 academics, particularly renowned people. What should be done in these circumstances from your experience, and what can we learn from Japan?
Yeah, it is very interesting that sometimes people believe there are migration models as well, like Todaro model, but we have to see that whether the people are migrating, why. It is not because of the low income. My argument, it is because of uncertainty and risk. They believe that tomorrow is not certain, and their daughters, sons is not certain. Uncertainty and risk coming, the people migrate. It is obviously. So that the important thing to address the migration, what we have to provide the stable policies. The conventional criticism always coming from the Japan side is your policies are not consistent. Your policies are always changing. When the policies are changing 5 years or 1 year time, we are changing policies, then people get into the uncertain situation. So I think this is when there is a crisis, of course, people are going out, but if the future is not certain, no one will remain.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions from the floor. Rishan, I wonder if we can get a mic by somebody, if somebody can walk a mic around. Miss Imai, can I trouble you to walk a mic? What I would really like is if we could collect, say, 3 questions, if you could give your name, and not a long comment, please, but a quick question. Sir, please, if you could just give us your name and ask the question, and then we'll collect them and then let the panel respond after about 3, please.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I'm Sunil Navaratne and representing Jagas, Japanese
A little
graduates.
louder, please, sir.
Yeah, I am Sunil Navaratne, representing Japanese Graduates Alumni Association. According to my understanding, Japan has a very strong private sector, especially conglomerate, and the conglomerate means they have banks, they have manufacturing, they have trading, they have insurance and everything. So it was very much helpful for Japanese economy to manufacture and trade the quality products to the world. I think that is one of the very important things we should highlight, and Sri Lanka can learn a lot from Japan. Not only that, but also the garment sector. Garment sector is giving fully support to the private sector. So in other words, in Japan, private sector work as the engine and garment sector work as a gearbox to support it. And the political sector...
So do you have a question that you're asking, not a speech, please?
Yes. So
what is the question? Can you come, please, with the
all
question?
This contribution, what we can learn from Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Next, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm Indrajit Pansu from the University of Colombo. My question is very straightforward. If you look at Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka has been running a current account deficit for a very long time and a trade deficit which is enlarging. And the suggestion is that not having an industrial policy that could be sustained in the long term is the issue. So my question is, what are the comments where we can get to an industrial policy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. Please, is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question?
My name is Malinda Meegat. I'm from Verite Research. This is just building off on Dr. Ganesh's point about like the lack of FDI or the relatively low amounts of FDI coming from Japan into Sri Lanka. I just want to ask about in comparing with Japanese early investment in countries like Taiwan, is there like a need to look at like if there's any specific symbiosis within like the Taiwanese sort of management structure within their organizations and firms and Japanese firms where it's much more easier for these firms to work together?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you want to start, Vice Chancellor? There's a question, I think, on conglomerates. There's one on industrial policy and one on FDI from Japan.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, this industrial policy is very important. Why the industrial policy is important? To allocation of resources for forthcoming industries and provide the structural change in the industrial structure. We need industrial policy. That's what Japan used. The second, of course, the industrial growth, the industrial organizational pattern, and particularly link between the large industries and small industries, that subcontracting system went in Japan very well. So therefore, industrial policy, as you rightly pointed out, we need to design very good industrial policy. So that should be there. The second question, where the foreign investment not come into Sri Lanka, of course, His Excellency also addressed it. One of the reasons, there are two types of Japanese foreign investment. One is those industries who are competitive within Japan. They produce large number of goods and services, and they have subsidies in Western Europe and North America and advanced countries to enter those countries. The other type of foreign investment is those who cannot compete within Japan. They go outside and then they do some production and link to the companies in Japan. So that is, of course, subcontracting system. Again, taking into other. Now, you know, in the world now, there is no made in Japan, no made in India, or anything made in particular country. There has been a made in waves in history, like made in England, made in USA, made in Japan. But if you call today made in Japan, maybe one product, but if you take vehicle, the parts are produced within all East Asian countries. This subcontracting system is essential. So whether the Sri Lankan firms can enter into this subcontracting system and go with the Japanese industry is very important thing.
You have any comment on any of this? On industrial policy, on things of that type?
On industrial policy, just to add to what I completely agree what the Vice Chancellor says, and perhaps in addition, well, I think Japanese industrial policies, it's perhaps formulated through consultation between the business and government. So there is an association of manufacturing companies like Automobile Association, etc. And there is a constant consultation between the government and those associations. And the government's industrial policies are formulated on the needs of the private sectors. So I think that's one good point of Japanese industrial policy.
Just to say from more global perspective nowadays, of course, having a policy that gives us the North Star is very important. But nowadays, in the world of fast changes, these policies cannot remain static, obviously, which means that you need the bureaucracy in the society that can anticipate, be agile, and also adaptive, right? And those are the new capabilities that education system and a society need to be nurturing. And I think few things we can draw parallel between Sri Lanka and Japan. One is those are both aging societies, right? So the workforce is rapidly reducing, and for Sri Lanka, people migrating, so perhaps it's also reducing at a much higher rate. So how do you keep up with that and also invest in new capabilities that are required to keep up with the change? And next is that I think both society have not fully succeeded in tapping into women as labor force, right? I mean, I think Japan's ranking on gender equality ranking is actually lower than Sri Lanka. So both societies sort of left half of the population behind in this economic growth journey. So I think those are the two things that probably require more thinking, careful thinking, and as the population reduces, how do we make full use of available labor force and capabilities in moving forward?
I want to pick up on that point and ask Ambassador, one of the things that people talk about with Japan's growth having slowed in the 1990s was this demographic problem, right? There's an aging society and a low birth rate in Japan, and Sri Lanka has that demographic pattern. It's different to the rest of South Asia. India has a very youthful population, as does Pakistan. What are some of the insights that you draw on the problems Japan has had with this population aging? And what do you think some of the solutions that Japan is trying to deal with this issue? Is it robotics? Is it other importing care workers? I mean, what are the ways in which we deal with an aging population? Because it's something we are seeing in Sri Lanka. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a good question. Actually, it's an area that Japan is perhaps failing. So we couldn't have adequately cope with these aging population problems. So the problems arising from aging population is first the burden for the financial burden for the government to keep the medical service, old age pension, etc. That is one thing. And also shortage of workforce, especially in rural areas. There are only very old people left, perhaps even over 80, and it's even difficult to find a taxi driver or bus drivers. So it's really a big problem in Japan. So as you said, robotics is, I think there is no one magical solution. So you have to make a lot of efforts in different perspectives. Robotics is one thing, and also we need more foreign workers. Japan was quite restrictive in having foreign workers before, but we cannot sustain with that system. So we are now open to foreign workers, including Sri Lankans. And we have this system called specified skilled workers to have workforce in several sectors, such as caregiving or agriculture or food service, etc. We need a workforce in every one of these sectors. So, and also better utilization of women's workforce as well.
Do you want to comment on the aging problem, Vice Chancellor, at all, and how we may deal with it here?
Yeah, actually the aging problem in Japan and Sri Lanka are in two stages. You know that, for example, before COVID coming, in Japan there were more than 70,000 people older than 100 years. More than 70,000 people older than 100 years. So we have not gone to that 10, but you can see the Japan is one of the world highest life expectancy ratio they have, and of course their level of caring is totally different than our level of caring. So I think that Sri Lanka can learn many lessons from Japan, because the values and attitudes tell us until the death they are working. So they are doing at least their own work by themselves. So this kind of a Sri Lankan system, we know that we are not retiring by 55 or 60, even 75 or 80 we are working. So this system is, we have to think about, the people must get the confidence that although we are little bit number in age older, but we can work until the end. So this positive attitude, and we have to inculcate the productivity relevant to that area, where in Japan, when one is retired from 60 or 65, they go to work in other place, or they go for agriculture again back. So that is very important area where we need to rethink about. Because when we retire, we give up everything, and we believe that it is the end of the life, and somebody should look after. We think so that's the problem in Sri Lanka. But the Japan, until the death, they are thinking that we have to work. The life, we have to contribute something for the future. Okay.
You want to comment on aging at all? Or? Well, I think we have reached the end of our wonderful session, and we started really with looking at this important issue of the Japanese economic miracle, which went from around the end of the Second World War to about the 1990s. And that was an extraordinary period where Japan was able to rise up from the ashes and become the second largest economy in the world after the United States, and certainly Asia's only rich country. And the genesis of this, as I read what Ambassador was telling us, was really something that started the Meiji Revolution, which I think was terribly interesting to modernize agriculture and shift workers to industry and create the surpluses, and I think break the feudal system, if I remember right, to period. There was also the interesting question of the Edo rules that people talked about, which brought in certain disciplines in Japan. And then there was this industrial push that came really from MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was very important in bringing about a whole lot of reforms. And I mean, one is struck really by the difference in some way and between the kind of MacArthur reforms of Japan and arguably what some people say is the disorderly exit of the US from Afghanistan and Iraq, where they didn't create same kind of reforms. And there's a very interesting parallel as to what went wrong in American aid and systems and the role of the military in that context. But it's very interesting issues for another place. But the MacArthur reforms were really quite strong. And I think one of the interesting points that you brought out, Ambassador, was really this breaking up of the zaibatsus to some extent, right? And reducing their power, introducing competition, forcing the globalization of Japanese companies, right? And I think that was really interesting. And METI played an enormous role, of course, in that, as did ID, JETRO, as did JETRO and others. And I think the embassies of Japan also played a great role in economic diplomacy, that right, in the process. And then as Japan evolved, there was this emphasis on infrastructure, right? Quality infrastructure. And I think that initiative is very interesting. And the Shinkansen obviously was a very important development of opening up the country to rail, as well as the emphasis, of course, on power, right? Having cheap power. And then there was, of course, the lifelong employment system. And so this contract, I think, was a very important set of developments right to about the 90s, where then Japan sort of growth kind of declined a bit, and Japan had to deal with both deflation, and then there was the very famous reforms of Prime Minister Abe with the three arrows trying to bring Japan out of this kind of deflation. And there was Governor Kuroda at the Bank of Japan that tried to bring in inflation as a very important way of trying to reflate this Japanese economy away. And his idea was that I think the previous governor had been a monetarist, and Governor Kuroda, who I had the privilege of working with when I was at the Asian Development Bank in the President's office, he kept saying, we will have extraordinary monetary policy and bring Japanese inflation up, but the disappointment, I think, that they had was this so-called third arrow of the reforms, right? And they were not able to bring in all the reforms. They got the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement done, which brought a lot of secondary reforms in Japan on trade and on other things, and also on the banking reforms, but they were not able to bring in these new reforms. Then from all of this, the question is this model of Japanese miracle transferable to other countries? And that's obviously an interesting issue. And can it be brought wholesale, or do we bring in pieces of this? And I was led by your 3 lessons, Ambassador. The first one you said was use external pressure from the IMF to bring in a set of reforms that can sustain Sri Lanka's growth, right? From where we were at this very low point, and we are beginning to see this. And you know, I have Governor here, and I'd like to commend him for the extraordinary measures that the central bank took. I was privileged to help some advisory in this regard and watch your progress. And you know, you have done an extraordinary job in stabilizing the economy, and I think we are very grateful to you bringing us to that position where we have reserves of 4.5 billion, inflation is 6.5%, and we have an exchange rate at under 300 or thereabouts, which is extraordinary when you think about what we have managed to achieve. The second part of the piece, I think, is something the President talked about yesterday, is that we have to have exporter-oriented growth. And we have to really find these new sources of manufacturing and also services which are below the radar to drive this economy from 10, 12, 15 billion merchandise exports, but also bringing in services. And we have to definitely join these value chains and supply chains across East Asia and bring in, obviously, the dynamism as India takes off at 6.5%, 7%, of linking to that Indian cluster. And I think we are hoping to get a trade deal done with India, and hopefully that will come. And the competitiveness also by ensuring a level playing field for industry, a lack of red tape, and also these very important anti-corruption issues that we talk about. So there's a transparent policy environment becomes very important. We have to obviously look at skilled people, as Vice Chancellor has talked about, and we have to try to give some sense of hope, particularly the young people in Sri Lanka, that this is a country worth investing in, staying long term, and that our children and our grandchildren here, and we want this country to succeed. So there's a lot of food for thought that we have, I think, picked up from today. And it's my very pleasant duty to thank Ambassador and the other panelists. And if you could kindly put your hands together, that would be really wonderful. Thank you so much.
That concludes our session for today. Once again, I would like to thank the Ambassador of Japan, His Excellency Hideaki Mizukoshi, and the Embassy of Japan, the Granbell Hotel for providing us with this venue, and our panelists and moderator for the discussion today. And I think we have a token of appreciation for you all. Ms. Azusa Kubota, Resident Representative of the UNDP. I'll ask the Ambassador to present there. Senior Professor H.D. Karunaratne, Vice Chancellor of the University of Colombo. And our moderator for today from the Geopolitical Cartographer, Dr. Wignaraja. Thank you everyone for attending.